Okay, hopefully everyone can see that landing page. Can I just check you can see it? Henry? Henry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can see it. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to give us a few minutes and then we can get going. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's just turned 2 o'clock, so I'm going to begin the webinar session this afternoon. Thank you to everyone that has joined us for our webinar, How Circular is the South African Economy? Essentially looking at a recently completed research study assessing economy-wide prospects for a more sustainable circular economy in South Africa. If I can please, in terms of the rules of the webinar this afternoon, if I can ask everyone please to mute their microphones and to keep it muted for the duration of the webinar. With the exception of the presenters, please do keep your video off. If you have any specific questions during the course of the webinar today, we ask that you pop them into the chat box, as we won't be taking live questions as such. And also just to note that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared with delegates post the event. In terms of the program for today, I will start with a welcome from Dr. Henry Roman from the Department of Science and Innovation, Acting Chief Director, Sector Innovation and Green Economy. I will then ask for a few words from Mr. Imran Patel, the Deputy Director General Socio-Economic Innovation Partnerships at the Department of Science and Innovation. And then we will go into the technical component of the webinar today with presentations from Professor Harro van Blotnitz, a professor in the Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and co-researcher on this project, Dr. Willy Haas, a senior scientist and lecturer at the Institute of Social Ecology at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Austria. Also, just to note that all of the final deliverables from this project will be made available via the Waste Roadmap's website. I've provided the link at the slide below. And we will also send up a follow-up email to all those that have registered for this webinar as well, to let them know as various deliverables become available and to share this recording. So with that, I will stop presenting on my side and I will ask Dr. Henry Roman for a few comments from his side. Thank you, Henry.
Thanks, Professor Godfrey. From our side, welcome firstly to everybody to this seminar on how is South Africa utilizing its resources to drive development. And also, with all due protocols being observed, a particular welcome to Mr. Imran Patel, our DDG for Socio-Economic Innovation Partnerships, who is actually here on a day that he's on leave. So I particularly would like to welcome him, as well as all other interested parties and our international guests that are present as well. So this particular seminar is to share the findings of the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap funded research project that was aimed at mapping the level of circularity of the South African economy. And you may be aware that the recently published white paper on science, technology, and innovation identified the circular economy as a new growth area. So this MFA is one of the first steps we're taking to get an understanding of what's happening in our system as the DSI is busy completing its decadal plan, and within that decadal plan, we'll be drafting an SDI for circular economy plan as a response to the white paper. And so with those few words, I'd like to hand back to Professor Godfrey for the next speaker. Thank you.
Apologies there, I lost my cursor for my mouse for a second. Thank you very much, Henry, for those welcoming words. With that, I'd like to welcome Mr. Imran Patel, the Deputy Director General from the Department of Science and Innovation, to provide us with some thoughts in terms of why this research is particularly important for the Department of Science and Innovation. Thank you very much, Imran, and welcome.
Thanks, Professor Godfrey, and it's the first time that I meet Prof. van Lotnitz and Dr. Haas. So my welcome to you as well, and thanks for the research that you're going to present later. In essence, Henry covered half of what I wanted to say. This work is critical for the DSI because we're at a stage now in developing, as part of our decadal plan, a much more bigger emphasis on the circular economy. There's still a lot of, I think, a lot of learning that needs to happen in the broader government system and with stakeholders around what do we mean by a circular economy. Sometimes it's associated with waste, etc. So the first reason why this work is important, and I look forward to the results, I've just briefly looked at it, is that it helps us get a much more clearer sense on a concept that is gaining a lot of traction, but I think it can be taken in all different directions if we don't have a firm base. And having a firm base is actually doing what they say is manage what you need to develop measures for what you want to manage, not the other way around. So sometimes it's quite difficult to develop some of these indices, but as a starting point, we need to get a handle we need to get some kind of handle on what exactly is the kind of status, the baseline. So the first reason is, I think it's going to start helping us shape a kind of a conversation within government and with stakeholders on what exactly we mean by circularity. The second reason why this is important, and I think we need to combine it with other measures, and hopefully Prof. Godfrey and Henry and the broader team, I can see a number of colleagues from DFF, etc., is to develop a set of matrices that helps us with a theory of change. And this is the big thing in government, to say, if you're wanting to move towards something, particularly in something like this, which is clearly a long-term project and even multi-generation, you need to be able to determine how you're moving towards the kind of outcomes that you want. So I think this work then helps us in conceptualizing that theory of change, and particularly how we measure and monitor. And then the last two reasons is that it helps us to plan on the basis of evidence, on the basis of where we can achieve the highest impact, what is possible, etc. So it helps us as DSI to then determine where is it that we invest in further research, in supporting our human capital development efforts, what kind of high-level graduates do we want, in what areas, is it in the extractive industries, is it around our exports, is it in agriculture, and allows us to do that. And it allows us to monitor and evaluate where we're going to. And then finally, I think it's an area that I'm not too sure will be covered in this seminar, but I think it's important for us as part of a global conversation about circularity. It's going to become increasingly an area that, if we're not ahead of the step as South Africa, we can have unintended consequences in terms of our trade, etc. So it's very important for us to be ahead of the pack, and that's why I'm glad we're working with international partners like, what's the name of the institution Dr. Haas comes from, so that we, in fact, building a kind of statistical and analytical base that is we are then able to use that in a way to have the kind of conversations we have to have with our trade partners, etc. Increasingly, as people do this, which we accept. I mean, people act in self-interest, but in order for us to be in a better position, this kind of work helps us to be able to get that. And hopefully, working with international partners can make our contribution to a greener, sustainable world by moving increasingly towards circularity in the areas that matter in South Africa. So I look forward to this. It's clearly early days. I know that there's been a few other material flow analysis work, Professor Swilling, there was the resource panel, and I think it's beginning to come together under the umbrella of the circular economy. And I think as South Africa, under the leadership of the Waste PMU and Henry and Georgina and others, our partners in other government departments, I think we're putting in place a very, very strong foundation for long-term impact and sustainability. Thanks, and I look forward to getting the detailed results now.
Thank you very much for those words, Imran. Before I do pass over to Harro and to Willie to take us into the technical aspects of this, can I please just remind all delegates to keep their microphones muted for the course of the webinar this afternoon. If you have any questions, just to note them in the chat box. And also, with the exception of our presenters, please do turn your microphones, your video cameras off. Thank you very much. With that, Harro, I will pass over to you to take us forward in terms of the results of this research project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you very much, Dr. Patel. A pleasure to e-meet you. The name is very familiar, but yeah, there is a whole bunch of colleagues at Chemical Engineering UCT who do work that interests the DSI, so we haven't had a chance to meet yet. And also Dr. Henry Roman, thank you very much for the words of welcome and the introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce this session. Willie and I will be sharing the presentation. It's been a collaborative project that started the beginning of last year. It's a real step forward in the research that I've been able to do as an industrial ecologist in South Africa, together with Willie Haas and his team, with Doris and Dominic, who mentioned here on the cover slide. There is a saying in the world of industrial ecology: if it's a material flow account, then there's a good chance it's been done by an Austrian. It's a topic of analysis that's really been perfected by colleagues in Austria, and a great thanks up front to Dr. Linda Godfrey for having made it possible for us in Cape Town to collaborate with the colleagues at BOKU, at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. And I think then we're just about ready. The presentation will run, now I just need to see that it does actually move, yes, through three short sessions. In the first one, we'll introduce the methodology and the overall results, and then we'll pause and Linda will moderate some questions. Then we'll delve into the major components of the National Material Flow Account, so you understand the results a little bit better. Then we'll pause again for some discussion, and then lastly, we'll go into an analysis of what the results really mean, and our conclusions. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Willie to please take us through the methodology and into the overall result.
Okay, thank you very much, Harro, and thank you very much for inviting me to all. And I look forward to this session, and I'm very interested in the discussions. So let me just get a few steps back and look into a very principal issue of metabolism. So any organism has a metabolism, so we humans have as well, and this functions that way that we have an intake of nutrients, we metabolize it, and we need that to live, to grow, and to reproduce ourselves, and so do organisms. of course, when they take in something, they might use it to increase the body mass. So when we grow, we need more substance in order to grow. Sometimes we grow because we are young, sometimes we grow independently of age because we take on body mass. And then eventually we have some outflows. So there are solid, liquid, gaseous outflows. And these are taken from a source, from our environment, and we give it back to a sink, our environment. And this is where sustainability issues emerge. It's not because of our humans, but maybe because we humans all together live in a society and work on that issue to generate intake and release output. What's the nice simple picture of this organism is that it's mass balanced. So all what we take into the system needs to either increase the body mass or become an outflow. So there's the law of conservation we can make use of in order to fill data gaps and to get a plausible picture. So what we can do for an organism, we can do for an economy as well. So a much bigger scale. And when we look into this socioeconomic system, the socioeconomic system has an intake as well. This intake might come from extraction within the territory, but it might be an import as well. And on the other side, when it's digested, when it's processed, it might become an outflow. It might become an export. The outflow might be within the territory, or it might be to the global environment, so to say. And what we have seen, like an organism can grow and become, let's say, fatter. An economy can become fatter. And so we have certain stocks in this economy, and one of these stocks is the population. I've done a rough estimate for the population in South Africa. I calculated that the people in South Africa altogether, if you weigh them and add them up, they are 3 megatons. And these 3 megatons need to be reproduced, they need to eat, they need to feed, and they take food, and they have some outputs. When we look then at the livestock, we have about 7 megatons in South Africa of livestock. So this is another stock that needs to be reproduced. And then we have finally the artifacts. So all the material from the small cell phone to the large power grid or factories or roads. And we reckon in a very rough estimate that there are 2,000 megatons. So all these needs to be reproduced. And this means material flows are necessary in order to operate this, to maintain it, or to extend the stocks. And this we can do from intake from outside, or we can look into recycling or cycling material flows in order to sustain these kind of different stocks. Again, we have the wonderful situation that this is mass balanced. So everything that comes in needs to become either an addition to stocks or an outflow. And this is again the way how we can operate and mass balance our calculations. Let's take it one step further and look into a more detailed scheme that we used and which guided us when calculating the material flows for South Africa. So we have on the left-hand side the biophysical trade balance. So it's the imports minus the exports. And we have the extraction from nature. This we can count. We have statistics. And together with recycling and reuse flows, adds up to the processed materials we have in the society. So everything that is further processed might then become either energy use, and this energy use might mean fossil fuels burned in power plants, or it might be food and feed for humans and livestock. And this becomes eventually emissions and vapor, or it becomes ashes and excreta. And the other fraction we process is for its material purposes, material use. And this material use becomes emissions and vapor in some circumstances. For example, when we go into the cement production, there is some carbon emissions that comes from the input material. So it's not the energy use, it's from the input material. Or when we produce bricks, the vapor evaporates. So this is the arrow that goes up. Then some of the material we process is a throughput material, so that is used within a very short time span. Maybe that's material we need for packaging, for containing something. And then a large fraction is is used for stock building. So we build up stocks, and of course this is mainly construction minerals and steel. And then in the next step, this all together can be assessed as interim outputs. So everything that is emission, vapor, that is ashes, excreta, or throughput material, or demolished stocks, that becomes interim outputs. And these interim outputs eventually might be recycled or reused, or they become outputs to nature, like water vapor, emissions, solid and liquid outputs. And now we can look into it by looking into all flows. What is the share of potentially renewable resources, the biomass, and what is the share of non-renewable resources? And one step further, and the biomass potentially, I mean, we have two different cycles in here. The first cycle is the socioeconomic cycling, so that is within the socioeconomic system. So for example, when we have a can, we throw it away, it comes back to the melter, and then new can might be produced out of it. This is within the socioeconomic system. With the biomass, we release it to nature, and our ecocycles might use that, and nutrients are cycled, and this we call ecological cycling. But the problem here might be, just a sec, I'm still, no, it doesn't work. Oh, yes. The problem might be that the way how we use biomass is not sustainable. For example, when it interferes with regeneration rates of nature, so it's not a sustained yield, or if we interfere with geochemical cycles like carbon cycles, water cycles, nitrogen or phosphorus cycles, if we interfere with the ecosystem quality, like we contribute to loss of species, landscape diversity loss, habitat loss, or nutrient depletion. So all these kind of things might contribute that the biomass is not renewable. Of course, fertilizer use, pesticide use, as well as fossil energy might contribute to that as well. And that's why we have to consider what fraction of the biomass can really be assessed as sustainable. And since the cycle, when you can go to the next one, the renewability is limited by any of these kind of interferences. So it's not additive, but as soon as the nutrient cycle is interrupted, it can't be interrupted, so to say, a second time. Okay, so these are the two different cycles we look into, and we have from this we have developed a metric where we look into it and relate the ecological cycling flows and the socioeconomic cycling flows to to the processed material. So this is on the input side. And then we can look into it on the output side when we look into the interim outputs and what fraction of the interim outputs can we assess as ecological cycling and socioeconomic cycling. And both can be then expressed as absolute flows or in the percentage of the processed materials, respectively, the interim outputs. Okay, and before we go now into a picture that shows all the flows for South Africa, just to repeat a few things, a few terminology issues that might be important. So when we talk about domestic extraction, we mean everything that comes from mining, farming, forestry, fishing within South African borders. If it's coming from outside, it's an import. It's all that is harvested, including residues if they're really used and grazed. So just remember the livestock is part of the socioeconomic system in this kind of thinking. And you could say cows are extract for human society when they graze. We have extractive waste that is part of the domestic extraction, and it's that part that becomes waste after some processing. So this includes tailings, slags, bagasse, etc. This is to be distinguished from unused extraction. That is material that is just moved in order to get to the material we want to get. So it's not processed. It includes stover left on field, overburden, waste rock, and this is not accounted for in our material flow accounts. Then maybe another issue that might be of interest, everything we look at is fresh weight. So this means in the case of biomass, it includes the water that is in there, the moisture content, and there are some conventions how much that is for different kind of materials. For wood taken from the forest, 15% and so on. Yeah, and dry weight is a weight of material excluding the moisture content. We just use that sometimes to make a calculation more plausible, since the water, you can imagine, makes some trouble because during the whole flows, water might become more or less in the materials we observe. And so we have to sometimes to go to the dry weight level to have a more plausible calculation. Then an indicator I mentioned already and use quite often is processed material, and this is all extracted plus imports minus exports plus recycling and reuse. So that is a kind of material that indicates what is the material that is processed within the economy and stays within the economy. And then when we look into stock building materials, we make a very pragmatic kind of decision and say everything where we assume that stays in the economic system for longer than a year is stock building. So stocks are in difference to consumables, something that stays within the economy for longer than a year. Okay, so let's have a look after this introduction. What are the flows in the South African economy? We start with a blank, so to say, Sankey diagram, and start on the left side where we see 32 megatons are imported, and the extraction in South Africa is 875 megatons. The bunker is just something to balance between what we have seen in the extraction statistics and in the production statistics. There are some differences, and we had to deal with it in that way. When we look into the extraction, we can look into the different material categories. I have to say our calculation is done with more than 100 different material categories, but we summarized them, we aggregated them in these 6 different material categories. So you can see about 70% of the extraction is biomass, 7% is the pure metal, 23% of it is the extractive waste associated to metals, 17% is this non-metallic minerals, so for construction and industrial minerals, and then we have about 30% that is fossil energy carriers, so that's coal in South Africa, and 6% is about the extractive waste that comes with the coal. So this is the picture for the extraction, and the imports. This is dominated by the fossil energy carriers. That's mainly oil that is imported. When we look into the exports, it's mainly the metals and the coal. And then we come to the processed material, and this is about 746 megatons, and these are on the one hand used for energy use. It's 330 megatons, and this is on the one hand the coal burnt and for power generation, and all the oil for transport and for all other kind of combustion to convert the energy. And the green part here is the food and feed, so that's, so to say, burnt in human bodies and in livestock. And the material use you can see here is to a large extent the extractive waste and the construction minerals that finally go then onto stocks. So next is the stock addition. From the 416 megatons, it's about 131 megaton that goes on stock. And this is mainly construction minerals. And then we come to the interim output, and there we have about 630 megatons that we accounted for. And a part of it is then reused and recycled. We have 3 megatons that is reused and 11 megatons that is recycled. And just to see that the reuse is, the gray part here is mainly bricks, clay bricks, and there is some wood that is reused and some plastics. And when you look into the recycling, it's quite evenly distributed between, again, paper, metals, construction minerals, and plastics that's recycled. And then when we have then the flows out to nature, before it comes to nature, the fraction is composted, about 4 megatons, and some parts of the waste is incinerated, about 2 megatons. And this means finally that we have quite some vapor. Emissions is 180 megatons. Dissipative use is 59. Dissipative use is, for example, fertilizers we use for in agriculture. So it's on purpose that we bring it out to nature. And then we have this large fraction of solid and liquid outputs that are 310 megatons. And the composition of these is then the emissions is mainly from fossil fuel energy, and the solid and liquid outputs is to a large share extractive waste from ore mining, metal mining, and coal mining. And then we can look into that fraction of biomass that is cycled. We estimated that 37 megatons qualify for a kind of sustainable use of biomass that that closes the loop in that way. So when we come now to the point to say what does it mean in terms of circularity, we relate these figures to the processed material, and this means that the socioeconomic cycling, so of the 746 megatons, socioeconomic cycling makes up 1.9%, and the ecological cycling makes up 5%. Together it's 7%. So it's due to rounding that you can't add these figures exactly, but with the other digits it would work like that. So 7% is the is altogether the input cycling rate. And when we go to the output side, you can see there we have 8.5%. So 5.9% is the ecological cycling, and the socioeconomic cycling rate is 2.6%. Okay, so this is the overall picture, and I hope you got the first impression on the kind of proportions and flows of the South African economy in biophysical terms.
Thanks very much for that, Willie. I see that we have had some questions posed in the chat box while you were presenting that opening part. And I'll just remind the delegates who've perhaps joined us since we started, please do post any comments that you do have in the chat box. Some of our colleagues who are part of the project team, I know Dominic has been responding to some of the questions already, so thanks for that, Dominic. But just to touch on some of them, I think there's one particular question which is sort of common across a couple, which deals with the issue of how is water dealt with in this material flow analysis, and how would renewable energy be dealt with in this particular material flow analysis. So Willie, maybe you could comment on that issue?
Yeah, so in these material flows, we do not account for the water that is just used for drinking or for industrial processes, other than the water that is then included in bottles or so. Yeah, so this water is included, but the other water is not included. It's only the water that is already part of materials as they are extracted, or if this water is used in a way that it's further processed. It's not that water is used for washing, cleaning, cooling, or something like that. Is really, if we would include that would wash away the material flows, so to say. Yeah, that's the first issue. What was the second issue?
The second one was in terms of how renewable energy is dealt with in the MFA.
Okay, so the renewable energy, we have to distinguish between different renewable energies. So the biomass is clear, that's accounted as material flow in here. And if you look into wind and solar, it's only that the equipment necessary for it is accounted for. But the energy, as soon as it becomes electricity, is not accounted for in here, since this is not a material flow. Yeah.
So similarly, one could develop a similar assessment of water, not necessarily the same year, but one could have a separate water flow analysis and a separate energy balance for the country as such.
Exactly, and for doing this, I think it needs other categories as we used here. Yeah, you need the green water and so on. You need to look into where the water is extracted and used, because it has different sustainability issues than most of the other materials.
I think it's important to stress that what we're looking at here is essentially materials.
Yeah.
There was an interesting question by Suzanne who wanted to know why water vapor is described as a non-renewable resource.
Okay, where did I describe it as non-renewable resource?
I'm not sure. Perhaps Suzanne.
I mean,
yeah, if you just go to your slide, I think it was the first or the second slide, where you started explaining very nicely, all the elements. If you just go back in the presentation to this one, yeah, you can see there on top of South Africa, somewhere there, water vapor, and it's blue. And I'm just looking at your legend.
Okay.
I'm confused.
Sorry, the water vapor could have a green cap as well, but of course, as soon as something is water vapor, it's not biomass as such. I mean, just to answer this question in a different way, when we look into biomass, we have to establish if it's sustainably produced or not. And this might be at different stages. And if the biomass is, let's say, to 50% not sustainably produced, then the water vapor would be not sustainable in the same proportion. Yeah, it's just that we balance the whole biomass over all the life cycles. And if there's something not sustainable, it's not especially because it's water vapor, but the share of the biomass is not sustainably.
Okay, but that just in the term non-renewable resources is a bit misleading, because that's for me a different thing. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Suzanne. I see there was also a question asked with regards to the data that was used for this, because as one can imagine, this is incredibly data intensive. And I see Dominic did allude to the fact that this will be touched in the next session, so we can park that particular question. So I think given the time that we have, just a reminder again to delegates, we will now go into some of the more technical aspects, looking at the different material flow components. And I would encourage you definitely to stay on to after this technical session, where Harro and Willie will give us essentially the key findings, the highlights, the conclusions, and the way forward, which certainly from what I've seen poses some very, very interesting questions for South Africa to consider in terms of its own development moving forward. So Willie, Harro, let me pass it back to you in terms of taking us through then the next stages of the results of the study. Thank you.
Right, I think I'm kicking off on this one. And when I share the screen, I'm not seeing anybody else, but hopefully this works. So this is the picture that we've showed you, and we're now going to go into some of the colors to just unpack a little bit what those flows look like. Just before we get there, the waste statistics are very important when one tries to estimate circularity in the system. And so we relied on the State of Waste report that has 2017 numbers. That was the reason that we selected 2017 as the study year, because that is the most comprehensive assessment of waste and its fates in the country. And unfortunately, it was coming out just as we started our work. Here are just a few slight deviations that we made from the State of Waste report. We have slightly more municipal solid waste than the report has. And then we included sewage sludge. On biomass, we have slightly less than what the State of Waste report has, or in fact significantly less, but that is because the industrial waste residues that are combusted on site at the sugar mills and pulp and paper mills are regarded as waste in the official waste statistics, whereas in the material flow accounting, it's only the residues that remain thereafter that are end-of-life materials. So it's some accounting conventions. The one way we really deviated from the State of Waste report was on construction and demolition waste, where we have almost 3 times as much in our estimate than what is officially known. And I think that has some significant bearing for how we talk about circularity around our built environment. In sum, we come to 111 million tons of end-of-life materials, where the State of Waste report has 107 million tons, so quite similar. And then we add the 170 million tons of extractive waste from metal mining and 50 million tons extractive waste from coal mining, and that gives us the 330 million tons end-of-life materials that was on the Sankey diagram. Just a little bit more on the construction and demolition waste, which is the major departure from official waste statistics. This is a highly uncertain game. Nobody in the country seems to have a better number than what is in the report. We used 2 methods to try to estimate this. In the one, we used the stock life of construction materials. We made an assumption on the long-term growth of the built environment, essentially the construction materials that remain in the system. And we used stock lives that had been estimated elsewhere. So how long does timber last in houses? How long does concrete last? How long does asphalt last on roads before it is replaced and becomes waste? We made some assumptions about what proportion of construction materials doesn't ever get into buildings but falls straight into the waste bin. And there we got a result of 17 million tons of what should be there. But we know that some end-of-life infrastructure just hibernates rather than gets taken down, so that may be an overestimate. In the second method, we looked at the waste data, the builders' rubble data that the major metros produce. There are big discrepancies there. It looked to us that the City of Cape Town numbers were most reliable, and we scaled those up to the whole population. We assumed that people in other metros produce as much builders' rubble per head as Cape Townians do, whereas in the rural areas, the construction and demolition waste would be much less, at only 1/5 of that in the urban areas. It was a rough guess, and that would give us 11 million tons, and that's what we ultimately stuck with for the construction and demolition waste. But let's get into the specific materials, and we'll go into biomass flows first. And I think, Willie, we said you'd talk through this slide.
Okay, the biomass flows, we have about 146 megatons of extraction and low imports and a bit more exports. And when we look into the extraction in more detail, we can see that it's dominated by primary crops and grazed biomass. And just a sec, I'm always fighting with my elements on the computer with the online platform. So when we have the primary crops, we can see that it's mainly cereals and sugar crops, and the fruits make up quite some amount in South Africa. The grazed biomass and the primary crops are the major fraction, but of course there are the crop residues that make up some part. We can see that the wood forest, also timber and wood fuel, that makes up together about 15 megatons. So it's an important share as well. The alien plants we accounted for as well, they are not so big. The fish capture, hunting, and other aquatic animals, they are not a big fraction of that. When we now look into it further, running through from inputs to outputs, we can see that the processed materials is mainly used then for energy use, and the energy use is a huge fraction for food and feed. And it becomes eventually water vapor and emissions. The manure is mainly the dissipative use here, and then we can see that there is a small cycling route. There is something that goes into compost, and at the end we have about 14 megatons of solid and liquid outputs to nature. And so the 146 megatons are the 17% of the overall extraction of 875 megatons, just to get this kind of proportion right. And when it comes now, the next slide. Okay, yeah. There are some more information just to give some data on some specific issues. So food waste makes about 2.5 megatons. The end-of-life waste has about 5.7 megatons of timber in there. That's mainly the paper. The stock add is paper for construction and a bit of straw. And the reuse, that's mainly the timber, so planks. And the recycling, this is mainly the paper recycling. Okay, and so we can see that biomass is quite a renewable resource, but we have some sustainability concerns here about ecological cycling, and the next slide will discuss this a bit more. In a first step, we looked into it, what we think, what is an important issue to establish a sustainable fraction of the biomass. And we looked into both where the big flows and where are the low rates of sustainability. And so we came up with with on the one hand the primary crops and the crop residues. There we looked how much is part of conservation agriculture and that we assumed to be sustainable. And then we looked into grazed biomass, and here we relied on an expert judgment. We had to discuss it for some time to get this, but then we saw that this is quite a low fraction of about 10% that we assumed here. This is up for discussion. We have done some uncertainty assessment here as well, but this is the range I think we should look at. And the next part, and it's so important to look into this since we know on a global level that this biogeochemical nutrient cycle has already transgressed planetary boundaries due to industrial and agricultural processes. And this means we really need to better understand this. And in South Africa, there is the Natural Capital Accounts Initiative. And this is extremely important for getting here better insights, and other scientific assessments will be needed to get a better evidence in order to better understand where can we really contribute to increasing the circularity here in our system. So, and
right.
Okay.
Shall I move on with the next flows? So the next major one in our economy is metals. And that's the picture that emerged. The light blue is the actual metals. The dark blue is the extractive waste that goes with it. Unsurprisingly, more of the metals that we mine are exported in processed or unprocessed form, and more of the waste remains behind. There's a little bit of metal material use. 7 million tons goes into stock add. That's mainly steel. And there's also a good portion of that gets demolished. Cars don't last forever. And also out of buildings, we get the metal back out, and it's valuable, and a fair bit of that recycles. But yeah, and the big solid liquid output fraction is the extractive waste that essentially stays very close to the mine sites. We were struggling a little bit to apply standard material flow accounting techniques to the South African mining sector, because it is so diverse and rich and interlinked. And there are significant flows between mining subsectors, as shown in this in this graphic. We have, especially around the element iron, we have it in multiple of the subsectors. So we don't only extract it in iron ore, it also comes with the manganese and the chromium, and in the intermediate products in ferromanganese and ferrochromium, iron is an important one. And so when we look at steel in South Africa, we have to understand where the various components come from. The PGM sector, which is so unique in South Africa, the platinum group metals, that in fact is a multi-metal business. It's not just about platinum or the platinum group elements, but it also has makes a very sizable contribution to the chromium industry, with chromite concentrate moving over into the chromium smelters. There is the precious metal concentrate, but there's also base metals, copper, cobalt, nickel, that are produced in that industry. And then there's a link again over to the copper waste. So we tried to capture some of those in diagrams. And here we show just the relationship between the iron ore, chromium, manganese, and then steel sectors. And the Sankey diagram here shows only the chemical elements themselves, not the tonnages that are mined. So only the Fe, the iron fraction of the iron ore, is shown here. And what we can see is the exports dominate for these as well. But we do have the sizable local steel production sector, with some exports of steel and also of secondary steel or scrap. And by comparison, again, the associate extractive waste that remains behind is very sizable. So those interlinkages are important when we try to understand the circularity as well, because you can't just tinker with one part of the system when there are linkages. And they add some level of resource efficiency to the system, because that portion of chromite ore that comes out of the PGM sector doesn't then have to be dug up by the chromium miners. Moving on, the next one is the fossil fuels, and here, as we have already said, they're dominated by the domestic coal, supplemented by imported oil. And the exports of coal are very sizable, and they're mainly for energy use. The extractive waste of coal goes straight through the system. The coal ash comes down here as sizable. That's almost 50 million tons, and there's a small portion of it that is actually used, about between 3 and 4 million tons of coal ash that actually becomes construction material. And so the finding from this is that in terms of energy, our economy is really dominated by fossil fuels, notably the domestic coal, and then the supplementation by the imported oil. Non-metallic minerals, here we're seeing also a very linear picture. These include both the industrial minerals and the construction minerals, and they are essentially used for material use only. There's no energy use. An important part are dissipative uses, such as in fertilizers, other industrial minerals that are used once, and the salts that are used in industry are poured down the sewer, essentially. But there's also an interesting question when you add gravel to roads. We know that there is dissipation as people drive on the dirt roads. Some of the material gets dissipated in dust clouds, so we had to make an estimate there. A really important flow in all of this really is sand and gravel. It's the bulk of the domestic extraction at about 90 million tons. Here we vacillated between taking the official number from the Minerals Council and the SAMI, the South African Minerals Industry Report by the Department of Mineral Resource and Energy, or taking a higher estimate that the United Nations Environment Programme offered. And when we tried to do the mass balance around cement becoming concrete, we found that the official amount of sand and gravel extracted would not be enough to use all the cement that is made in the country in the recipes that the building industry uses. So there's an under-reporting of sand and gravel, and Willie tells me that this is actually a global phenomenon. Sand and gravel often don't report what they take, but they're very important in terms of the national material flows. And Willie, then we come to this last slide in this section, and I think you're talking through this one.
Yes. We have looked into the metal part, and we distinguish always what is the end-of-life waste, what is the recycling, and what is the reuse, and try to zoom into our calculations to show you what we can find there. So the steel is something where recycling is already quite a routine, and some reuse of metal frames we assumed. So you can see here that of the AOL waste, more than 50% were recycled, and a small fraction is reused. In the case of copper, there is quite some recycling. There is some routine on that. The lead has the advantage that it is used in just a few products, mainly in car batteries, and they are quite well recycled and collected. So there is a very high recycling rate. And here we have the aluminium, and with aluminium we had some discussions. There are some numbers around, but there is quite some uncertainty. We could not really get to the ground what the essential figures are. There is an issue of new scrap and old scrap. So you can see the lower three, copper, lead, and aluminium, are all on the same scale of 600,000 tons. And the steel, of course, is another order of magnitude. Okay, and then let's go to the concrete. So it's we come more to the building material. There is some recycling, but it's challenging. That's a worldwide issue that concrete that is broken down is not so easy to be used other than for backfilling. There is some reuse issues with concrete. The wood is a material that is essentially, in terms of planks, are reused, and the recycling is mainly the paper recycling, and the clay bricks is something where we did some estimate on the reuse. I have to say reuse is something that has never been assessed quantitatively in any of other circularity assessments globally, as far as I know. So it's quite some new issue to dig into that and to establish some figures on the reuse issue. Okay, and plastics is quite challenging. We have here an amount of plastic that is recycled and a very small amount that is reused. But we said that it's challenging and there's work in progress. There are some plastic pacts going on and some negotiations how to improve the situation here. And finally, we have quite a good issue. It's the container glass, where the reuse is quite well developed and works quite well. And so this is one of the encouraging kind of flows where there is already a long tradition of reuse of the material, and the recycling works not very good, but there is a good recycling on the way. Okay, and
right, and I think that's taken us to the end of this session. The finding from this slide is that we see pockets of high circularity in the domestic economy, and also significant informal activity around what we call cascade use, reuse, and recycling. Right, yeah, and okay. We'll pause it here.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Harro, Willie. I just want to pop through some of the questions which I've seen posted in the chat box, starting with the one around a comparison with other countries. And I'm going to park that question because I know that that is something that you will touch on in later slides in terms of reflecting on where South Africa stands. A question in terms of whether construction and demolition waste is not often incorporated under the municipal solid waste figures. I don't know, Harro, if you want to touch on that, given the uncertainty around our C&D waste.
It often is, of course, disposed with the municipal solid waste, and the data situation around municipal solid waste is just very difficult. We know that many landfill sites don't have the weigh bridges operating properly, or that what goes in there is reported correctly. We know there's significant informal dumping of construction and demolition waste. So the State of Waste report tries to report construction and demolition waste, and it says 4.5 million tons, and that just looks way too low by the methods that we used here.
Thank you, Harro. And then I think there were, oh, sorry, Willie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just one small issue, but it's always astonishing how difficult this CD waste is. In Vienna, colleagues of ours from the Technical University did some assessment of aerial photographs from one year to the next and looked how many buildings disappeared and estimated the waste and looked into the statistics. And we have quite good statistics in Austria and Vienna. And it turned out they have 1.5 times more CD waste when looking into the aerial pictures compared to the statistics. So this is a big issue.
Thank you for that, Willie. I think there were a few questions that kind of, I think, wanted to sort of place themselves within the Sankey diagram. So perhaps you can speak to where would we, for example, find textile waste within the Sankey diagram? Where would we find electronic waste? And where would we, for example, find plastic waste? Those particular three waste streams.
I'll start maybe. The textile wastes, so we of course have many materials that become composites, so we extract cotton and we import cotton, but then we might use it as pure cotton and it as a biomass, or we mix it with polyester in a cotton polyester mix, and so the textile waste would on the output side be within the municipal solid waste, and therefore the solid and liquid outputs. The electronics is again a composite of plastics and metals. So we account for the plastics as fossils and the metals as metals going in. On the output side, it's partly in the recycled materials. The waste statistics do show e-waste and its fates. So we split it between what is recovered in metal and what is disposed. And the third one was...
It was e-waste, textile, plastic.
Yeah, plastic is if it's not mixed in with other things, of course it often is in the automotive use. It is mixed with all sorts of other materials into automobiles, and then there's residue. The metals often recycled, and the plastic would be disposed. So I think we relied on the waste statistics on the one hand and the sort of extraction and trade numbers on the other. We only paid attention to a couple of so-called technical flows where materials really are fused into something different. So steel that has a mix of several metals, concrete products like concrete blocks and plaster and mortar, we made a group there, clay bricks and container glass, some of the technical materials. And that was also a little bit of pioneering work in the way the material flow accounting number crunching is actually done. I think we added a few calculation steps so that our Sankey diagrams are better linked between the input and the output side, and so it started to show these little spider webby effects for some of them.
Thanks very much.
May I just to take this from another perspective? So the main issue how we deal in the material flow accounting is that we look into the materials as they're extracted and try to follow them throughout. Yeah. So when it comes to waste, we have certain waste categories that are because it's collected in a certain place or it's toxic or something like that. So we have all these wastes, and then we tried to assign it to certain material categories again. And as soon as it is a major product group there, we try to understand what is the average composition of a car or of a car battery or something like that. And then we did the assignment of the waste flow to these kind of different material categories by this kind of composition. And that's the way then. So the textiles, as soon as we can see there is a bigger flow of textiles somewhere, which was not the case, then we would assign it to the different kind of material categories accordingly. Yeah, with the e-waste we could do it like that. That's the way, because the main issue is that we need to be mass balanced till the end. Yeah, so we we always view all the products and wastes in this kind of classes of different material categories.
Thank you, Willy. I see there's a question here with regards to zinc. Was it considered as part of the extractive metal MFA? I'm not sure if it was explicitly mentioned in one of the slides.
I'm sure we've got a line for zinc in the spreadsheet. The numbers are currently quite small. But yeah, it might even have been one of the metals where we got those strange effects that when we added domestic extraction and imports and then subtracted exports, we actually got negative numbers in the first pass, which really got us to scratch our heads. Are we actually stripping down our domestic stocks and ending up exporting more metal than we dig out the ground, which is possible if you think that we're stripping down old gold mines where there's a lot of metal in there. But yeah, so the zinc is in the calculations. We didn't make a separate diagram for it. We know that zinc in the Northern Cape is a major growth industry. And when we come to interpreting what does circular economy analysis really means, we might sort of have to start thinking whether that tradition that South Africa has had of focusing its economic activity on digging out metals and exporting them is something that is the wise way forward. But yeah, we know that it might grow to 1 million tons, so it will show on the radar screen in 10 years' time.
Thanks, Sarah. A question, or maybe just perhaps a comment. We know that more than 90% of our aggregate sand and gravel are illegally mined in this country. I suppose this is a tricky aspect with regards to an MFA in terms of how we deal with things that may not necessarily flow through formal systems. So whether it be, for example, informal collection and recycling or reuse, or informal extraction of resources, those elements are not dealt with in the MFA, are they, Harro? Or perhaps that's my question.
Yeah, look, so the mass balancing comes to the rescue because we use the formal statistics, and then Sally, my master student, and I just try to balance the construction materials. We know how much cement is made because that's a fairly reliable statistic. And if you then take the recipes that you need, 3 sand and to one cement, and to make certain concrete products, you find there isn't enough sand in the official statistics, enough sand and gravel to make all the concrete that we must have. And so, we then had to correct that. Unfortunately, there was another estimate out there, and that worked better.
Thank you, Harro. A question with regards to tire recycling. Do tires appear in the Sankey diagrams?
I mean, we accounted for the tires that do not appear in the Sankey diagram as such, but as I said before, we looked into the number of tires, and then we looked what is the composition of a typical tire, and then it's in the waste fraction. We tried to assign it then to the material categories. So it is in there, but it is not shown as tires.
And I'm sure a lot of these details, which may not necessarily be in this sort of short presentation, will also be in the full technical report. So people who might specifically be looking for their waste streams of interest, I'm sure will be able to find more information than in the final report. A question with regards to wood waste needs to be differentiated between treated and untreated wood waste. The former is difficult to recycle or find suitable markets. Contamination is also problematic. I'm not sure if if you want to comment on that, if that was at all dealt with.
Look, I can just comment quickly from earlier research that we did around the informal use of construction offcuts and demolition timber, which is very worrying. When the treated stuff falls into the informal sector for not so much for informal material reuse, but informal energetic use, then we know that people inhale the copper, chromium, arsenic dusts and fumes when that stuff burns. So yes, in as much as construction timber is dominated by roof trusses, which are always chemically treated, that is a major concern. Yeah.
Thank you. And then I see one with regards to paper and pulp, where specifically that is addressed.
Yeah, so the biomass graph of what we extracted, and I'll quickly run back to that pie chart. So here we have the timber split between industrial roundwood and fuelwood, and the industrial roundwood again, I think, split it between, we use the official production statistics there, between what goes into pulp and paper making as opposed to what goes through sawmills into construction. And then we have the amount of paper that goes into the economy and the paper recycling numbers from the official waste statistics. Yeah, so I think we've captured. We're not showing in the Sankey diagram explicitly the production, the industrial production phase, more than that we show processed materials, and that, you know, that's a catch-all. There's a whole value chain, of course, there of how stuff, primary and secondary materials, get combined, and how they get refined and then into product manufacture assemblies and final products. We appreciate there's a whole material flow for different sectors there, but that's not the sort of major objective to describe all of those transformations step by step.
Thank you. I think, you know, one of the issues that we deal with in South Africa, but also internationally, is that there's sometimes confusion around this term recycling rate, in that very often it's actually a collection rate, so it's an input for recycling, and sometimes it's a true recycling rate, output recycling rate. I would imagine that because you're dealing with a mass balance here, where you are talking about recycling, it is actually the true output recycling rate, not simply what is collected for recycling.
That's correct.
Thank you. There was a question, if we were to prioritize waste, is C and D to be part of our priority in South Africa? I don't know if you want to speak about that now, or whether you want to park that until you go into the key findings. I'll leave that one up to you.
Yeah, I think we need to understand construction and demolition waste much better, and what people do with it. And to some extent, we'll come to it in the interpretation.
Perfect. So I see that there aren't any new questions that have popped up since I've been asking. So if there's nothing else, then Harro, Willie, I'm going to pass back to you in terms of taking us through essentially the final concluding thoughts. Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to screen share that again, and I think, Willie, it's over to you to start this session.
Yeah. Okay, just a second. I'm fighting with my elements on the screen because they hide the slides. Okay, but okay. So you remember this scheme? Hopefully, it's the scheme of the materials that flow through, and then we have the processed materials, and we relate the input cycling to the processed material, and the output cycling we relate the cycling to the interim outputs. And now the next slide shows now this picture in numbers in more detail. So when we have the processed materials, the 746 megatons, then we can see that what we found to be recycled is 11 megatons. This makes up 1.5% of the processed material, and the reused material is 3 megatons. This is the 0.4%. I hope you can remember some of the fractions we were discussing what this was. And the cycled biomass we looked into, we assessed that there are 37 megatons that we consider to be sustainable use of biomass, and this makes up 5%. Altogether, this means 52 megatons are cycled in South Africa, and this means 7%. And now, since we have some uncertainties here, we wanted to understand them in more detail and went into that and looked what would be the lower range and what would be the higher range of our different data, and we assumed that the processed material might range in this margin between 670 and 900 megatons, and this would alter the total cycling with the uncertainties that come in a second. Yeah, down here, between 6.5 and 14.6%. So that's the range for a lower and a higher. And the main uncertainty comes in with the eco-cycling. That's the main issue here. So there's 6% difference between the lower and the higher range. And now we try to make a different estimate to be very optimistic about sustainability I think this is a very important issue where a lot of research needs to be done to establish better figures in here. When it comes to socioeconomic cycling, the difference is not as big. Still, there is some difference of socioeconomic cycling, and this mainly comes from the reuse. As I said, reuse is something that is not commonly assessed in such assessments, and I think it's a very important issue. We have the problem that we know in circularity strategies we should prioritize issues like rethink, reduce, reuse far more than recycling, but all what we do is we count for recycling. So it's very important to add up these other perspectives. So there comes another uncertainty in there, and the recycling uncertainty is not that big. So that is more or less the picture, and we are quite confident with the 5% within these kind of ranges. And when we look now into the next slide, we have done the same now for the interim outputs, and there you can see that we have this 8.5%, and this is again 6% about for ecological cycling, and 2.6% for the socioeconomic cycling. And now we phrased the question a bit differently, and here you can see the comparison between the input and the output cycling rate. And the main difference between the two is that the net addition to stocks makes the difference, because the interim outputs is the same like the processed material, but minus the net addition to stocks. So then we were looking at what is really the fraction of the overall flows in the South African economy that can be discussed in terms of recycling. And when we take the processed material that are processed in South Africa, then we can see that about 180 megatons are emissions, and 66 megatons are water vapor, and 59 megatons are dissipative use, so what we put on purpose out into nature. And this leaves us only with 441 megatons that we can discuss further. Then of these 441 megatons, we have the extractive waste from coal mining and the extractive waste from metal ore mining, and we have net addition to stocks, so what gets caught up, so to say, or accumulated in stocks. So it leaves us only with 103 megatons we really can discuss for recycling, given that extractive waste is really the portion of the waste where you can't do anything more with it. So that is really something that brings into question the issue, how should we deal with a circular economy when only of the 746 megatons, 100 megatons are available for recycling.
Oh, meneer Stein.
Okay, and this brings into question the overall question of how is the proportion of material flows in South Africa and what needs to be done in order to get more circular. Another issue we were looking into is what was really striking when we looked first at it was that the addition to stocks is relatively low. So here you can see the stock addition in South Africa is 15% of the domestic extraction. So stock addition is important, since stocks are everything that provides services to society. And it seems so that South Africa uses quite few parts of a very low share of its extraction for providing services to the economy and the people. When we look into the European Union, we have 60% of domestic extraction that is used for building up stocks. And when we look into the per capita values, we can see that in South Africa it's 2.3 tons stock add per capita in a year, and in Europe it's 8 tons. I'm not saying adding more material to stocks is more sustainable, but the question is this 2.3 tons of stock building or stock aid really enough in order to provide good services for the people? So let's look into China. There is another assessment that has been done exactly following our methodology, and they show that about 71% of domestic extraction is used for building up stocks, so even higher than in the EU, and this in 1995. And when we look into China 2015, it was 18.7% that was used for building up stocks. So in per capita issues, China is always kind of stretching all the limits. So here it's 10 times more material that is used for building up stocks in China. When we look into a comparison, what we have done, Dominic has mainly done this for world regions, and we put now the amount of South Africa in contrast to it. So you can see here for different world regions what is the stock aid per capita and year for example, in the industrial old world, so it's Europe mainly, or in the industrial new world, it's countries like the US, or in the former Soviet Union, Asia, and you can see that South Africa is of course, adding more stock aid than in other sub-Saharan countries, but it's more or less in a range, like India or Latin American countries. So that's the range, and there is the question if there's a need to consider that stock building should be directed on the one hand more for community and business services, and that there is some improvement necessary. So when you go to the, okay.
Sorry, Billy, can I pop in at this point and just particularly ask a question before you do move on? When you're talking stocks, you're talking about our roads, our railways, our buildings, our houses, our dams, our infrastructure, the stuff that we're building within our economy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, of course, it goes till small things that stay in the economy for longer than a year, but the bulk is what you mentioned. I mean, the roads and the buildings and the industrial infrastructure, dams or something like that, are really making up a huge share of these stocks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Willie, I think we're coming to the last two slides.
Yes.
Right, so it's for me to summarize. And so the picture really is what we want you to take away, a very linear version of economy in terms of material flows. We have 5 major findings. They have already appeared on previous slides. The one is in terms of the material flows, this economy is really dominated by export-oriented activities. Of course, there's a large residue of those export-oriented activities that remains domestically in our economy in the form of big tailings dams and ash dams and so on. But that's the first major finding. The second major finding then was energetically, this economy is dominated by fossil fuels, notably domestic coal supported by imported oil. And there was a good question earlier, what about renewable energies? Well, if they were very large in South Africa, they wouldn't show on this diagram because this is not an energy analysis. But we know that they aren't very large at this stage. And so we can make this finding quite confidently at this stage, that energetically we have this dominance of the fossil fuels. The third finding that also has been there already is that there is a sizable footprint of bio-based activities. In our engagements with the various extractive sectors, we find that there is some attention to ecological cycling. There is the work of the Forestry Stewardship Council for wood and timber. There is the SASSI work around fishing. There is attention to sustainability in primary crop production in the grain and sugar industries. And there's attention to sustainability of land use in grazing. People talk about it, but there are also very significant concerns from some of the experts that we engaged with. So that is an important finding. Circular economy involves both socioeconomic cycling and ecological cycling, and there are significant concerns on the latter. The fourth finding was what Willie was just speaking to, and for me that's one of the most unexpected findings. When I set out to do a circular economy assessment, I wouldn't have expected to find that we put too little stuff into the economy, into the domestic economy, but we really have to look at this. Now it makes sense. We have spoken for many years in this country that we underinvest in infrastructure. We know that a large number of our compatriots live in very difficult conditions in self-constructed houses or shacks. And there's probably a lot of cascade use that has gone into that, reused materials, great for circularity, but not great for quality of life. So we really have to look at the size of the domestic economy relative to the size of our export flows. And the fifth finding is the one that we know, and we've documented the pockets of high circularity and also significant informal activity around not just recycling, but also cascade use and recycling. And each of these findings then leads to some potential strategic options for intervention that we have put into a briefing note, but we've not really made a slide to talk through what are the ways that we can address this. So we're going to ask Linda to distribute our briefing note to this audience, and you can then read what we think are the strategic options around each of these findings of how things can be improved. Maybe we have a bit of discussion time left. I can't see my clock right now, so I'm going to go to the very final slide first, and then we'll have discussion time, hopefully. So out of all this work, we think that the national development model, and we weren't sure whether we should call it the national development model or the national business model, because some people just view it as a business model, but it should be about developing our nation. Priorities probably will have to shift if we're going to have a more circular outcome. On the one hand, that is going to be brought to us by changes in the international scene. The climate and circular economy policies of our major trading partners will change the global policy and business environment for South Africa, no doubt about that. It will have major impacts on our export of coal and possibly in time also on our metals that we supply to others. I mean, there might be a shift. We might see less demand for iron and steel and more demand for things like copper as the global economy rebuilds and changes its focus. And then, of course, our power generation that depends on coal will also be changing. There's that vulnerability to change. And we have seen that the related extractive wastes are more than 50% of our outputs to nature. What are we shifting to? We want to shift to an economy that has a fatter loop around the domestic economy, a circularity around the domestic economy. And so what we'll need is a proactive strategy that allows the country to seize the opportunities that such a circular economy potentially offers. We want to see new businesses offering the services that the population needs and isn't getting at the moment. We want those to create decent jobs for all skill levels, and that those, we think, should be tied to a stronger domestic economy with lower environmental impacts. And that's what circular economy really should be, and that's the sort of picture that we should be striving to achieve. How do we get there? Well, it will require substantial changes, mainly in those sectors that are built around take from nature, refine and sell to somebody else, take the money and retire somewhere nice. So that is mining. Maybe also is agriculture, although people who live on the land often want to stay there also for their retirement and try to look after it, but maybe they don't have all the means, or the system doesn't allow them to do it in such a way that it remains a nice piece of land. Definitely in transport, urban planning, that domestic economy, the power sector, and then services. So all of those will see big changes if we move into a more circular economy. And the research that needs to drive that, and the innovation that results from that, to change that system, that will demand a systems focus, and that's our recommendation really to the Department of Science and Innovation. Circular economy is not about creating more opportunities for people to push trolleys when you're sitting in the Department of Science and Innovation. We know there's very important livelihoods, but there are better jobs that should arise in future than collecting the excesses of the 10% who overconsume and try to eke out a living pushing that trolley. So we want to see very different jobs arising around that fat domestic loop of materials. And I think I've said everything that's on the slide. Is there anything? Yeah, that's it. So with that, just the acknowledgements, the funding from the Waste RDI Roadmap. Linda, thank you very much for making it possible and for your guidance and support and big interest in how the study has unfolded. To our team members, especially Doris, you're on the call. You did those wonderful diagrams. Thank you. And then also the people on the right hand of this slide who volunteered some of their time in November last year when we had a first estimate of the diagram, and who critiqued it and who gave us further leads. That is much appreciated. And if you're on the call today, the picture may have changed somewhat, but also not that much, I think, from what you saw in the first draft. Thank you very much. Linda, I think we're back to, and we I think have a good bit of time for discussion.
Yes, thank you, Harry, and thank you, Vili. Perhaps if I can ask you to pop on the slide that has the 5 key findings, because I think that one is always I suppose when I first saw the results, it was kind of expected, because we sort of know the economy that we're in, but then at the same time, also just so many surprises that we saw along the way. So, I think for me, the take-home message was that, yes, we have this extractive-based economy. We're mining resources, we're exporting a fair chunk of those. We've got these throughputs of sort of bulky waste streams from the mining industry, very little of which actually has the potential for circularity. But maybe there's opportunity for innovation in mining smarter, that we actually take less sort of overburden and rock material with it when we do mine. And in fact, it raises this question: are we actually using the country's resources in the best interests of its people? Or are we in fact using our resources and allowing other countries to obtain socio-economic benefit from it, and we're essentially left with the pollution and the waste to deal with as a country and an economy in future generations? So really a great study, and congratulations, Harry, to you and your team, and Vili as well, to you and your team on putting this work together. And I'm sure from the comments and certainly the attendance that we've had today, there's a lot of interest in this particular topic and delving into this in more detail. So I think with that, there are a few questions that we have, and certainly we encourage any other final comments that people might have. Starting with the first question, and I think it relates to the issue of stock building, given the fact that we have such little investment of stock in South Africa, is: do you think that perhaps it has something to do with climate? I'm assuming it's climate.
An interesting one, yeah. We in winter we're always reminded that we should be putting a double layer of glass on our windows, and so maybe our houses are a little bit flimsy. Yeah, but when I don't know, what is the proportion? What's the number of people that live in shacks? Sally, was it 7 million people? Just over 10% of the population actually still don't have a decent house. So it's the inequality that that plays a significant role there. And then I think one has to just look into, are the bulk services there? There's of course many metros that should be putting more pipes underground to bring the water in, the water out. So are the roads getting the attention they need, other than through the e-tolling saga? Are we building railways? We ordered some locomotives from other people, but it seems we only paid money, and I'm not sure what we got for the stocks. So, yeah.
Before I move on to the other questions, perhaps just a question of clarification for myself. We always, after extensive work and numerous data that went into this, very often just for the sake of understanding, we try to whittle this down to one number. So can I ask you, you gave an input cycling rate and an output cycling rate. The input cycling rate was 7%, the output cycling rate was 8.5%. So if we had to say South Africa is X percentage circular, which one would it be? Would it be the 7% or the 8.5%?
In my view, these different rates have different functions. If you really would look into the circularity, I would go for the input side. If it is more about where should we target certain output side activities, waste management activities, I would go for the output cycling rate.
So essentially we could say South Africa is 7% circular.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. All right, there are a number of questions, and I suppose a lot of these findings now link to the issue in terms of, as we transition to a more circular economy, do we create new opportunities for jobs for enterprises? So there's one, do you have any information about the green jobs creation that could be created with the transition to circular economy in South Africa and the optimization of this material flow? I think we've discussed this one. We've discussed this one before, Hera, in terms of it would be so nice to actually map onto this MFA, the job picture, and maybe that's a future study as well that can actually be undertaken.
That's right, Linda. Sorry, I'll just get my picture back. Look, a decade ago, just over a decade ago, the green economy made its entry into policy discourse in South Africa. And there was then a green economy jobs study, and a lot of that would still hold. When we say the ecological cycling is important, we should be asking: have we maxed out the opportunities for jobs in care of the landscape? And I think a lot of that has happened there. But the green economy had its limitations, and I have to admit here, I've been one of those who was quite skeptical about bringing a new discourse on circular economy to South Africa when we hadn't really maxed out everything that the green economy policy work had promised us. Got very sticky to push through some of those things, and state capture played a role while for example, the renewable energy jobs hadn't materialized some time back already, and they must come through. But as we're looking at the circular economy I think if we understand that it's about growing the domestic economy in a service-heavy fashion, so obviously that does need materials, but that the services that the people should get are created, then the job matrix that we're looking for is somewhat different to people building solar and wind, or working on water and working on fire. So, a job study, again, I think would be very valuable to do, a circular economy job study, informed by the earlier one and updating that, but then focusing on what are those services, what are the materials that need to go, and, what are the new trades that we have to have in this country to build the habitat so that everybody has a decent house and isn't cold in winter and burning all sorts of rubbish to keep warm.
There's an interesting question here in terms of, I suppose, sort of benchmarking. What would one expect to see in terms of, let's say, a stock per capita in a circular economy as opposed to a stocks per capita in a linear economy? And I mean, even there, from what we've seen from your study, we've got huge differences just in stock per capita in a linear economy. So I suppose an interesting one, and I don't suppose there's no country in the world that is circular, so we don't have an indication yet of what that might be.
And two things I would like to add. The one issue is, I think what we need to look at is not just what is circular, we need to look at what is not circular. Yeah, when we look into the European Union, yeah, there is a higher degree of circularity, but what is not circular per capita is higher than what is in South Africa. Yeah, so what matters for the environment is what is not circulated. Yeah. So that is a very important issue here. And I wanted to add something to the discussion before about the jobs. There was a study done for Australia, and there they came to the conclusions that you would need less jobs in a circular economy in certain sectors and more jobs in other sectors, and this means you need other skills. And the main issue is not that you lose jobs. The main issue is how to make the job market, the labor, fit for a circular economy. And this is a major kind of undertaking to get the skills moved from the one to the other side. Yeah.
Mm. And absolutely, and in terms of who takes the lead in actually transitioning sectors and reskilling and upskilling sectors in advance of what's coming. Is it government? Is it the private sector? Is it a combination? Yes. Absolutely. And I think certainly we've already seen the impact of that in our coal industry and some of the impacts in Mpumalanga, for example. There's a question here, would also be interesting to see the economic value addition of local beneficiation along the value chain versus the pit-to-port economy. I haven't seen that term before.
Linda, just repeat that one, please.
It was would also be interesting, maybe perhaps just a comment would also be interesting to see the economic value addition of local beneficiation along the value chain. So instead of this whole, extract and export, if we were actually beneficiating locally and the economic benefits that would provide to the country just simply than the sale of materials.
Yeah.
And one needs to do the economics properly. So if the economy hasn't been growing and it's too small, because we know that because there's too many people who are not taking part. So we want to measure the success of a larger and more circular economy, not simply in GDP, but we want to measure it in the participation of people who've been excluded. So we want to ask, how inclusive is that economy? And so, yeah, when one does such an economic assessment, please don't just add the value add in pure monetary terms, the GVA.
Yeah, may I just add one other issue, and I think it's quite important. The issue of stocks again, the multi-purpose stocks. So when you have an extractive economy, you have to build up a certain set of stocks that is geared towards extraction and getting the material out of the country. And this is really a stock set that serves this purpose and nothing else. When you have a circular economy where you really look into small businesses and so on, you have to build up stocks that serve multiple purposes. You need to have better roads, better housing in the country, countrywide. Yeah, and this, I think, is another kind of big benefit that would I don't know if to what extent it would show up in an economic assessment of the value chain, but I think it's a very important economic effect that is beneficiary for so many people. And so to develop a kind of stock set that provides services for small businesses and quality of life at the same time throughout the country.
Absolutely. Here's an interesting one. I suppose it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question. Will the adoption of circular economy lead to a better distribution of wealth in this country, or do we need to ensure a better distribution that will encourage circularity?
Look, circularity in itself is not necessarily an aim. Several commentators on the idea of circular economy say it should be a means to get to an aim. So in that sense, I would say let's keep that aim in mind and then pick the means. And I think if we focus on growing the domestic economy, with so many people not taking part in the domestic economy, the best way to grow the domestic economy is to bring them in. So, and that should lower inequality. I think that the problem with the inherited extractives is just that. Somebody with capital comes there, employs a few people on a very low labor, sends the material off, monetizes the money on the London Stock Exchange, and buys themselves whatever they want elsewhere in the world, and maybe a nice mansion in Sandton or Cape Town too. So the extractives focus has never been particularly inclusive, and so when we go to a more domestic economy, we must make sure that that's not just 20% of the population trying to spend its money on the other 80% carrying drinks and taking away the rubbish.
And I suppose it comes back to this critical question in terms of how, as a country, do we use our resources, and are all South Africans actually benefiting from the resource-rich country that we actually do have? There have been a number of questions and comments posted with regards to jobs and the importance of decent jobs, the importance of decent work. I'm not going to go into those in more detail. I think we've had some discussion around jobs and the importance, I think, of understanding the potential for job creation within a more circular economy in South Africa. So please do forgive me those that have posted questions about the jobs. I'm going to park those for now. But there's one question here. How does the circular economy model account for the cycling and stock building of non-mass-based resources and artifacts, such as software, intellectual property, etc.?
Billy?
Yeah. I mean, it's not accounted for, but I have to say there are many things not accounted for, but they show up indirectly. Yeah. So when you have a software industry or software that is able to smartly manage resource flows, the resource flows should be reduced by that. If the software is mainly contributing to increasing the energy demand, then it's showing up here. So it is not directly shown, but the effects of all these kind of activities is shown here. The same is with electricity. Electricity is not shown in here, but as soon as it comes from materials burning coal, or so it's shown in here as burning coals. As soon as renewable energy sources are used that are not non-material in the main part, it shows up because the material flows shrink. So this is the way how it's all the activities we do in society are expressed here in physical terms. But the data flows as such are not shown, but the cables that are needed, or the power that is needed, or the equipment that is needed shows up here.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Willie. I think then in the last few minutes that we have, just to wrap up the discussion, once again, a very big thank you to the teams from UCT and from BOKU. I think in my mind, for the first time, we have truly an evidence-based approach to understanding the current level of circularity within the South African economy from a materials flow perspective. I think we have a good understanding in terms of where there is opportunity for change. Some of them are sort of big changes that we're asking for in terms of how the South African economy currently operates. An understanding of where there is potential, and also the fact that there may actually be a cap to the level of circularity of the South African economy if you look at these big bulky waste streams that are coming out of our mining sector, for example. I think, the one thing that we do know is that we do have political support at the highest level for a transition to a circular economy, and certainly it's been spoken about a number of times in terms of South Africa's post-COVID-19 economic response. The president has called for a recovery that is transformative, that is inclusive, that is digital, green and sustainable. And also noting that the president noted that we cannot afford to be out of step with international moves towards green growth and green development. So I think it's quite clear as a country in terms of where we are wanting to go. It's quite clear that, we are a resource-rich country, but certainly for some of these resources, we may have limited years of available resources in the ground, and we need to understand also the limitations of that in terms of future economic development. So with that, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank, we've had a wonderful attendance this afternoon. At some point, we were well exceeding 100 delegates on the call, and I would like to pass it back to Dr. Henry Roman from the Department of Science and Innovation, just in terms of his closing comments and words and way forward. Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you everybody who was in attendance today. As Linda indicated, we reached just more than 100 people, which took us by surprise. We didn't expect that much interest in the work, but it's also very comforting to know that the work we're doing it generates that much interest as well. But I'd also firstly want to thank the research team led by Professor von Blottnitz and Dr. Haas, and also to thank Linda for bringing this to DSI, and despite some initial hurdles we had to overcome, persisting, and we've got it done. It takes a lot of work sometimes in the background to get certain things pushed through the system. But also from my side also, my initial training as a biochemist and zoologist, the use of the organism to illustrate the conservation of mass is particularly appealing, because as you know, if you look at how hormones work within a cell, you have a trigger and then the output could be quite far removed from where that trigger happened on the cell. And in looking at the system as we have here, we start to get a better feel and understanding of what's happening within the organism, in this case in South Africa. One of the things in my view is that a transition to a circular economy should be more economically inclusive. However, by continually updating the MFA, as Mr. Patel indicated, we can gather the evidence to help us to guide the policy landscape. It's something that's a continual process. It's not something that you're going to do in the next 5 years or the next 10 years. It's going to be a lot longer than that. But you need to be working on it continually, sort of taking a piece of the elephant as you go along. I also just want to highlight that as DSI, we did give quite a tight time frame to this work. There's a lot of things we could have done if we had more time, but sometimes you need something to start a conversation and to start a discourse. And that's what I wanted out of this work, is to get the ball rolling so that we can have the necessary conversations at the necessary level so that we can actually move and make a transition. And if we do the update, then we can have a way to monitor, to evaluate and to learn at specific points in time going forward. And keep in mind that what we're doing here is we're not working on a speedboat. We're working on the Titanic. We're shifting an economic system. It's not that easy. So there's a lot of work to be done. there's a lot of work happening right now around data acquisition, data management, and we spoke and we saw the lack of data when it comes to the ecological cycling. The natural resource management team at DFFE are looking at consolidating their data management and acquisition. In the water sector, I've just this week been participating in a data acquisition management team looking at wetland data, which is also part, and all of this also relates back to natural capital accounts, which we have a 10-year plan for as a country. So all these things are starting to come together, and then we'll have the data that would improve on our MFA outputs as we go forward. Now, lastly, also, the work will be made available to everybody. And in my view, it should also be the basis of the discussions we have at policy level on the transition to a low carbon economy, a circular economy, a green economy, whatever coat we want to put on a transition to a better economy for human well-being, as well as for planetary well-being. And then from the DSI side, we're obviously going to take this work into consideration, and the evidence provided into how we develop our science, technology, and innovation for circular economy plan that will be in place for the next decade. And with that, I'd just like to, once again, to thank everybody for their participation, for the really good questions that were raised that help guide us going forward, and your time this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Henry. And just to wrap up, as I said, we will be making a recording of this session available. I'm aware that that some stakeholders were not able to attend today, so feel free to distribute that recording to fellow colleagues. As Harro indicated, there is a short 4-page briefing note, which is an extended executive summary of this work that has been done, and we will also provide the link to where that can be accessed as well. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending today and wish you a wonderful evening going forward. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
I know it's by heart.